What broke me was not only that he cheated, it was how long our life had been asking me not to notice. By Monday morning, his side of the closet was empty, but the house still looked married. That was the first cruelty of it, not the affair, not even the leaving. The first cruelty was the ordinary face of everything after. The pale blue mug still drying beside the sink, the extra set of reading glasses on the hall table, the indentation his shoes had made over the years in the small woven mat by the back door, the rosemary bush outside the kitchen window moving in the wind as if weather had not just crossed our threshold and taken a man with it. I woke before dawn out of habit and lay in the half-dark listening for him, which was humiliating in a way I had not been prepared for. Not because I wanted him back in that moment, not even because I missed him exactly. It was because my body, after 28 years, still rose toward the shape of a life that no longer existed. My hand moved across the sheet to the cool emptiness where his shoulder should have been, and for one suspended second I forgot. Then memory returned in full, clean, and merciless. He had moved out on Saturday. Not dramatically, no slammed doors, no scene. Daniel had always understood the power of appearing measured. He folded shirts into neat stacks, carried boxes to the car, spoke in the steady voice one might use while discussing a delayed train. He told me he did not want to make this harder than it already was, as if hardness were something he could still regulate, as if after betrayal, the manner of packing could still count as kindness. I stood in the kitchen and watched the coffee drip into a single cup. For years I had made it strong because he liked it that way, though I always preferred mine softer, less bitter. On that Monday morning, I stared at the dark stream filling the carafe and understood absurdly that I no longer had to make coffee I did not like. The thought was so small, so insultingly small in the face of what had happened, that it almost made me laugh. Instead, I cried for the first time that day, quietly, one hand pressed over my mouth, while the dishwasher hummed its dull domestic hymn behind me. People imagine heartbreak as a grand rupture, a glass shattering, a door closing, a sentence spoken in a tone that turns the whole room to ash. But sometimes heartbreak arrives disguised as a list of practicalities. It arrives as a man asking whether he should leave the travel folders in the study, as a request about who will keep the spare set of keys to the lake house his parents left them, as two toothbrushes in a cup, one blue and one white, and the sudden need to decide which one belongs to the past. I had been a wife for so long that my grief did not first come to me as pain. It came to me as administration. There were things to cancel, things to move, things to explain, 3 grown children to answer without collapsing in the middle of their questions, utility accounts, insurance papers, a dinner reservation I had made months ago for our anniversary in early summer. Before I knew the marriage had already become a performance, I was still the only one rehearsing. At 56, I knew how to function through almost anything. I had learned it the way some women learn a language, slowly, repetitively, until it became indistinguishable from character. I had functioned through my father's long illness when the children were teenagers and Daniel was traveling for work more than usual. I had functioned through my mother's grief after the funeral. Through school forms, fever nights, broken appliances, birthdays, tax years, dental emergencies, Christmases for 10, and summers that looked effortless because I had spent 3 months quietly arranging them. Functioning had become my most elegant disguise. Even now, in the first stunned days after he left, I found myself wiping the counters, watering the indoor plants, sorting laundry into lights and darks. I folded his absence into tasks because tasks had edges, and pain did not. Pain spread. Pain entered everything. Pain could make a woman stand in the pantry staring at 3 cans of tomatoes because she could not remember whether she had intended to make soup or simply needed a reason to remain upright. Our house had been the center of our family for almost 3 decades. A white clapboard place with green shutters and a porch deep enough for late summer dinners. The children had grown up measuring themselves in pencil against the laundry room wall. Every Christmas there had been cedar garlands wound around the banister and candles in the front windows, and too many potatoes because Daniel always insisted there should be too many potatoes. Every July we took boxes of outdoor lights from the attic and hung them in the trees because our daughter said they made the garden look like it believed in miracles. From the outside, ours was the kind of marriage people pointed to with softened faces, the enviable kind, We had weathered time. We had traditions. We had the ease of a long-built life. Family photographs would have suggested a quiet success. Beach towels draped over shoulders, children in windbreakers, Daniel's arm around me in front of rented cottages and mountain trails and anniversary dinners by the sea. I used to believe those photographs were proof. Not of perfection. I was never foolish enough to demand perfection, but of substance, of devotion, of a love that had matured into something less fevered and more durable. We had not been dramatic people. We had not spent our years in crashing arguments or reconciliations that burned up the furniture. We had spent them in rituals, calendar pages, mortgage payments, school concerts, meal plans, flights booked 6 months in advance because Daniel liked having something to look forward to, or so I thought. Only now, standing in the house after he had gone, did I begin to understand that future planning is not always faith. Sometimes it is camouflage. The affair had not been discovered in one operatic moment. No lipstick on a collar, no lover at the door, no obvious lie so outrageous it split the marriage cleanly in half. If it had happened that way, perhaps I would have had the mercy of immediacy. Something undeniable enough to save me from months of translating my own intuition into gentler language. Instead, it came to me as dissonance, a series of notes that did not belong to the melody I had spent years learning by heart. There was the phone he began taking into the garden when he used to leave it on the kitchen island for hours. The softened way he smiled at texts he did not mention. The business trip to Lisbon that felt oddly sealed off, as if the days there belonged to another weather system entirely. The fact that he came home attentive but absent, kind but unreachable, like a man compensating for something he had not confessed even to himself. When I asked whether everything was all right, he said he was tired. Work had been complicated. He was getting older. Sometimes he felt thin in himself, he said, as if all the years had caught up at once. I accepted this because I had spent most of my marriage accepting emotional shadows as if they were weather. Temporary. Meaningless unless repeated. I gave him the grace I would have wanted someone to give me. I interpreted silence generously. I told myself that long marriages had seasons and that not every winter was a warning. Then one Thursday afternoon in late March, while looking for a receipt in his email because our accountant needed one before the weekend, I saw a hotel confirmation forwarded from a personal account I did not recognize. 1 room, 2 nights, not during Lisbon but 3 weeks earlier, in our city. It could still have been explained. Anything can when a woman has trained herself to keep explanation alive, but there was something in the haste of the forwarding, the private email account, the date. It landed in me not as proof but as a pulse. After that, I noticed everything. A charge on our joint card for a restaurant Daniel had not taken me to. A scarf in the back seat of his car that was not mine and too young, somehow, in pattern and silk. The way he turned his phone face down when we sat across from each other at dinner. The fact that tenderness had returned between us in careful installments, almost as if he were monitoring an inventory. The truth, when it finally came, was not cinematic. It was almost worse than cinematic. It was administrative and tired and stripped of drama by his need to keep control over the tone. I asked him directly in the study on a Wednesday evening, while rain pressed against the windows in soft, relentless taps. Is there someone else? He went still in the way people do when they are not deciding what is true, but what they can afford to admit. He sat down in the leather chair by the bookshelves and put both hands on his knees. I remember noticing that he looked older than he had the week before. Not because guilt had transformed him, but because secrecy had finally lost its posture. It's complicated, he said. There are phrases that reveal more than the facts they follow. It's complicated was one of them. It did not contain denial. It did not contain outrage at the accusation. It contained management, narrative, an attempt to place a frame around the thing before I had seen its full size. I did not scream. I did not throw the lamp from the side table or demand the woman's name in a voice fit for theater. I stood by the window with my hands cold and said, "No, it is. It is one of the oldest things in the world. Either there is or there is." He looked down. And that was how 28 years ended the first time. Not with the affair itself, with a man looking at the floor. Afterward came the versioning. The affair had not meant what I thought. It had happened during a period when he felt lonely. He had never meant for it to continue. He had been confused. He still loved me. He did not want to lose the family. He did not want to erase everything we had built. Those sentences entered the room and fell at my feet like garments cut from someone else's life. I could not put them on. They did not fit the scale of what had happened. What devastated me most was not simply that he had betrayed me. It was that he spoke as though the betrayal existed separate from the life around it. As though there were the affair on one side, regrettable and self-contained, and our marriage on the other, intact enough to be referenced with sorrow and respect. But marriage is not a museum with separate wings. A lie in one room changes the air in all of them. When I asked how long, he gave me a number I later learned was false. When I asked whether he loved her, he said that was not the right question. When I asked whether he had ever intended to tell me, he closed his eyes for a second before answering, and that second told me more than the answer did. After the first confrontation came weeks of suspended living. He slept in the guest room. We moved around each other with impossible courtesy. The children called and we sounded normal. We discussed groceries, a plumber appointment, a leaking gutter above the garage. There are humiliations marriage prepares you for and humiliations it does not. Few are sharper than discussing roof maintenance with the man who has split your life open. In those weeks I learned something I had not known about grief. It is often delayed by logistics. The body postpones collapse when there are forms to fill out, meals to put on plates, conversations to survive. I kept thinking the pain would arrive like a storm. Instead, it arrived as a climate, constant, pervasive, inescapable. Our eldest son, Thomas, came first. He drove down from Boston on a Friday night with the brittle fury of a man who wants to fix something that cannot be repaired. He stood in the kitchen with his coat still on, looking from me to Daniel and back again, as if the architecture of his own life had suddenly become suspect. "You should have told us," he said to his father, though of course he meant you should not have done it. Our daughter, June, called 3 times in one day and cried on the second call, then apologized for crying as if her sorrow were adding to my burden. Our youngest, Eli, who had always hated open conflict, kept asking whether there was any chance of working it out, which was another way of asking whether he would have to choose a shape for the family that no longer matched the old one. I watched their pain rise and, like so many women before me, nearly stepped forward to organize it, to soften, to explain, to preserve their father from becoming too ugly in their eyes because I knew something about what it costs a child to see clearly. I could feel the old instinct opening in me like a practiced hand. Manage the emotional weather, make everyone more comfortable, keep the room survivable. But betrayal had already taken enough from me. I could not spend the remains of myself protecting the man who had created the storm. So when Thomas asked, "Was it just one time?" I did not say something noble and vague. I said no. When June whispered, "Did Dad lie to you?" I answered, "Yes." And when Eli, after a long silence, said, "I hate this," I said, "I do too." Not because bluntness is always healing, but because truth, for once, needed to be allowed its full body. After Daniel left, the house became evidence. Every room carried my authorship in a way I had never before fully seen. The dining room with the long oak table I had sanded and refinished one summer, while Daniel was away at a conference, because I wanted the grain to show through more softly. The linen closet stacked in disciplined towers, because children who grow into adults still return home needing clean sheets and the feeling that someone prepared for them. The mudroom hooks labeled years ago in my careful handwriting, when 3 small coats and 3 small backpacks hung in a row like a promise. I moved through those rooms as if I were visiting the museum of a woman who had mistaken usefulness for reciprocity. This was not to say our life had been false. That would have been too simple and therefore untrue. The children were real. The holidays were real. The soup simmering on winter afternoons, the long drives to the coast, the years of orthodontist appointments and music recitals, and laughter over badly assembled furniture. Those things were not counterfeit because the marriage contained emptiness I had not yet named. But I began to understand that reality itself can be unevenly held. I had supplied the meaning of the life, Daniel had inhabited it. That difference might sound small to anyone who has never lived inside it. It is not small, it is a fault line. In the early days after he moved out, I found myself wandering into the study where I kept our family photo albums. Not the digital archives on the computer. The real ones, linen-bound, heavy, labeled in metallic pen by year and place. Tuscany, Cape Cod, Christmases, the children as babies, then lanky children, then adolescents already half-turned toward their own futures. I had made those albums because I believed memory deserved a physical form. Because I thought if I printed the photographs and slipped them into pages and wrote captions beneath them, I could give shape to our life. Not just preserve it, bless it. One afternoon, I opened the album from the summer we rented a house on the coast in Maine. June was 19 then, Thomas 22, Eli 16. Daniel is in many of the pictures, grilling fish on the deck, reading in a canvas chair, smiling beside me at sunset with a glass of wine in his hand. We look happy, more than happy. We look settled inside one another, like a couple who had arrived somewhere earned. But looking closer, I saw things I had never let myself see. The brightness in my own face had a quality of effort to it, a kind of hopeful insistence. Daniel's expressions were warm, yes, but oddly removed, as though he were stepping into scenes already underway. I could feel, even from the still images, what those days had actually been. I had planned the trip, packed the coolers, chosen the house, researched the beaches, remembered sunscreen, booked the restaurant for our anniversary dinner, suggested the board game after rain trapped us inside. Daniel had shown up for all of it, pleasantly, generously even, but he had not carried its emotional center. He had not made the life. He had participated in the one I kept making. There is a particular kind of heartbreak that does not come from discovering a new fact, but from finally understanding an old pattern. That afternoon, with the photo album open on my lap, I think the marriage ended in me for the second time. Not because the affair mattered less. It mattered terribly. It was an act of cowardice and appetite and self-justification that had cut through the core of my trust. But the affair was no longer the deepest revelation. The deeper revelation was that for years I had been living inside the appearance of mutuality. I had mistaken maintenance for intimacy, ritual for reciprocity. I had thought that because our life was full, our marriage must also be deep. And perhaps I had thought that because admitting otherwise would have required a loneliness I did not know how to survive then. Women do this, I think, not all women, but enough of us to form a quiet nation. We read steadiness as love because steadiness is survivable. We call a man reliable because he comes home, pays bills, books the flights, carries the heavy boxes, remembers to salt the driveway in winter. We build gratitude around these competencies and hope they can hold the weight of what is missing. Sometimes they can for years. Until one day they cannot. Daniel texted often in those first weeks after leaving. Not grand declarations, no florid apologies. He texted like a man trying to remain plausible. Questions about the children, about the spring insurance renewal, about whether I had found the spare charger for the lawn equipment. Once he sent a memory, uninvited, past the little Italian place in Portland today. Remember that anniversary dinner? Thinking of you. I stared at that message until the words blurred. Thinking of you. As if thought were a form of repair. As if memory itself could excuse the conditions under which it had been made. A week later he called and said perhaps, in time, we might find a way not to throw everything away. That phrase lodged under my skin like splintered glass. Throw everything away. It was the language of a man who still believed the marriage had been a pile of objects we both owned equally. A house, a family, a history, a store of vacations, birthdays, tax returns, furniture. But what I wanted to say, what I did not yet know how to say without shaking, was that he had thrown something away long before I refused to pick it back up. He had thrown away the right to be protected by the beauty I had made around us. Still, there were moments when I was tempted, not by him exactly, but by structure, by the old architecture of my days. There is a grief so practical it can masquerade as longing. I missed the known shape of my life. I miss saying we without needing to edit the sentence. I miss the ease of there being another body in the house, another set of keys, another witness to the mundane. I missed the fiction of being accompanied. One evening, unable to sleep, I walked barefoot through the downstairs and ended up in the pantry where I kept folders of travel confirmations. It was a ridiculous system Daniel used to tease me about. Each trip got a color-coded folder: flights, lodging, restaurant reservations, museum tickets, maps I printed even when we used our phones, because there was something in me that trusted paper more than batteries. There, in the drawer marked summer, was the folder for the trip we had planned for September. The Amalfi Coast. 10 days, a terrace with lemon trees. I had booked it in January, when winter was at its grayest, and Daniel had stood behind me with his hands on my shoulders while I compared hotel reviews. We had talked then about the sea, the food, how lovely it would be to go alone together again, as if we were returning to a simpler phase of us. I opened the folder and looked at the itinerary, the flights, the transfers, the notes in my own handwriting: reserve boat day, ask for quiet room, Daniel likes morning light. My body folded around a pain so sharp it felt almost clean, not because the trip was lost, not even because he might have known, while I was planning that future, that he was already elsewhere in himself, but because I saw with total clarity what I had been doing for years: manufacturing forward motion, creating horizons for a marriage that had already stopped arriving emotionally, decorating the absence with destinations. I sat on the pantry floor with the folder open beside me and cried in a way I had not yet cried since he left. Not neatly. Not in the controlled, tear-wiping way grief allows when children are calling and the kettle is boiling. I cried from somewhere older, somewhere wordless, for the humiliation of how sincerely I had believed. For the tenderness I had kept extending into a space that did not return it in kind. For the woman I had been, competent, loyal, hopeful, endlessly arranging beauty around a bond that had quietly become one-sided. At some point, my friend Marian arrived. I had texted her earlier, something vague: "Are you home tonight?" And because she had known me for 30 years, she heard the fracture underneath it. She let herself in with the spare key and found me on the floor. Marian did not rush to comfort me with bright language. This is one of the reasons I have loved her. She sat down beside me in the narrow pantry, elegant in a camel coat and impractical heels, and looked at the spilled pages on the floor. "Oh, Alina," she said. "That was all. No advice, no false fury on my behalf, no speech about beginnings disguised as endings. Just my name, spoken as if it could hold what had become unbearable." I told her everything then, not the edited version, not the socially acceptable outline. I told her how long I had ignored my own loneliness, how often Daniel had accepted the life I built without entering the labor of it, how the affair had devastated me, yes, but how what was killing me now was the recognition that I had helped preserve the illusion of a marriage by translating every absence into something gentler. Marian listened with the stillness only a true friend can offer. When I had finished, when the pantry smelled faintly of paper and onions and the tea she had forgotten to make, she said, "You know what hurts the most? Not that he lied. It's that you kept telling the truth smaller so you could survive it." I closed my eyes. Because that was it. For years I had made reality more manageable by reducing its size. I had not lied to myself outright. I had simply edited, softened, cropped. I had made each disappointment local, each loneliness temporary, each asymmetry understandable. And because none of those edits were individually fatal, they had accumulated into a life that still looked whole from a distance. The next morning, I moved his winter coats from the front hall closet to the guest room. It was not revenge. It was not a dramatic reclaiming. It was simply accuracy. After that, small acts began to change the atmosphere of the house. I threw away the coffee I did not like and bought the lighter roast I preferred. I moved my reading chair into the window where Daniel used to sit on Sunday afternoons, not because I wanted to replace him, but because the light was best there, and I had spent years pretending not to mind. I slept in the middle of the bed, at first out of defiance, then out of relief. I stopped cushioning him for the children. When June asked whether she had to invite the woman to anything if the relationship continued, I said, "You do not have to make yourself comfortable to keep other people from facing what they've done." When Thomas said he was afraid he would become his father without meaning to, I said, The fact that you are afraid of that is one of the reasons you won't. When Eli asked if I still loved Daniel, I answered honestly. Love is not the question that saves me now. There were still days of collapse. I do not want to dress healing in clean lines. There were mornings when the air itself felt unbearable. I would find one of his old sweatshirts in the laundry room cupboard where I kept rags and feel a wave of missing, so physical it frightened me. Missing is not always evidence of what should be restored. Sometimes it is just the body mourning its habits. There were bureaucratic sorrows too. A meeting with a lawyer whose office smelled of lemon polish and toner. The first time I had to write separated instead of married on a form. The practical division of things accumulated over nearly 3 decades. Furniture, savings, serving dishes received as wedding gifts and used so often their origin had blurred into ordinary life. I learned that grief is not only emotional, it is spatial, financial, linguistic. It changes how you move through a grocery store, how you answer the question, "Are you waiting for someone?" How you explain your life to the receptionist at the dentist when she asks whether your husband's insurance still covers you. Summer came anyway. The hydrangeas along the side fence opened in pale blue heads, indecently lush. The garden, which I had planted in phases over many years, continued its patient work. Lavender, peonies, climbing roses. I used to think gardens taught endurance. That year I thought they taught indifference. Bloom happens whether or not a woman's marriage survives spring. In June, our family was supposed to gather for a long weekend by the lake, a tradition Daniel and I had kept for years. The children assumed perhaps we might still do it, separately or together, depending on how civilized everyone managed to be. I considered it because I knew how much those rituals had meant, especially as the children became adults and continuity turned from routine into inheritance. But one afternoon, while reviewing the reservation details, I realized I could not do it. Not yet. Not because the lake had become contaminated by memory, but because I understood for the first time that I was under no obligation to preserve every tradition at the expense of my own coherence. So I called the children and said we would not go this year. There was disappointment, of course there was. A silence on the line after I told them. Then June said softly, "Okay." And in her okay was something I had not expected. Permission. Not from her to me, but from life itself. Permission to let what had broken remain broken without immediately turning it into a project. That weekend, instead of packing coolers and towels and board games, I stayed home. I bought myself white roses at the market because they reminded me of my grandmother's garden. I stripped the guest room bed and turned it into a space for painting, something I had not done seriously since college. I made scrambled eggs for dinner and ate them on the porch in the blue hour while the neighborhood moved around me with summer innocence. Sprinklers ticking, a dog barking twice and then settling, someone laughing down the block. Nothing dramatic happened. And yet I remember that evening as one of the first in which my life felt more mine than abandoned. By late August, Daniel asked if we could meet. There was paperwork to discuss, yes, but that was not the real reason. I could hear in his voice the tone of a man beginning to understand that permanence had entered the room. Consequences had texture now. He wanted, I think, a version of closure that would preserve his image of himself as decent. We met at a cafe halfway between his apartment and the house. He looked thinner, more tired. His hair, always carefully kept, had grown slightly unruly at the temples. A small part of me responded with old tenderness, and I hated that it did. Love, even after betrayal, does not vanish on command. It leaves in currents. He asked how I was. I said, "I'm learning." He nodded as if this were noble rather than devastating. There were practical matters first. Numbers, dates, signatures still needed. Then, after a pause, he said he knew he had hurt me beyond anything he could properly account for. He said he had been unhappy for a long time and had not known how to say it. He said he had felt peripheral in his own life, as though everything had become more about family than about us. He said the affair had started as an escape and then become something he had not intended. I listened. Once I would have rushed to understand him, to gather his sadness into something coherent, but accuracy had begun to grow in me where accommodation used to live. Do you know, I said, what is hardest for me now? He looked up. It isn't imagining you with someone else, though that is awful enough. It's realizing how long I kept calling our marriage full because I had filled it. He said nothing. I made meaning out of every ordinary thing, I continued. The holidays, the trips, the dinners, the traditions. I thought we were building a life together. And maybe in some ways we were. But I was carrying the soul of it, Daniel. You were carrying the appearance. His face changed then, not in outrage, not even in defensiveness. More like recognition had entered him against his will. That isn't fair, he said finally, but without force. No, I said, what you did wasn't fair. What I'm saying is simply true. He looked out the window for a long moment. I did love you. I know, I said, and I meant it, but not in a way that required enough truths. There are sentences a woman waits half her life to be able to say without trembling. That was one of mine. When we parted, he touched my arm as though memory still gave him rights. I stepped back, gently but clearly. Outside, the late summer light had turned gold along the sidewalks. I walked to my car feeling wrung out but not destroyed. That difference mattered. Autumn arrived with its usual theatrical competence. Maples turning in sudden flame. The air carrying that first clean note of cold after heat has overplayed its hand. For years I had loved autumn because it made domestic life feel newly intimate. Soup, candles, wool blankets, the reopening of inner rooms after summer expansiveness. That year, autumn taught me something else. Beauty can return without asking permission from what has ended. I repainted the bedroom, not because color heals, but because walls hold memory too, and I wanted to sleep inside a shade that belonged to no previous version of us. I chose a muted ivory with undertones of gray, soft in morning light. Marian helped me move the furniture and said, from atop the ladder, "This is less renovation than exorcism." I laughed for the first time in weeks with something like my whole body. The children came home for Thanksgiving. I had not intended to host. There was too much history in it, and history was still volatile. But one by one they called and asked, not directly but enough, whether we might gather at the house anyway. Not with their father, not to pretend, just to be where they had always been. So I said yes. We kept it smaller, simpler. No elaborate centerpieces, no 6x ambitions, no polished performance of abundance. Thomas brought wine. June made the stuffing. Eli chopped vegetables with earnest concentration and more force than necessary. We set the table together. There was grief in the room, but there was also something steadier than grief, truth shared without adornment. At one point, while clearing plates, June put her arms around me from behind the way she used to as a teenager when she wanted comfort without asking for it. She rested her cheek against my shoulder and said, "This still feels like home." I turned and kissed her temple. Because that was another truth I had earned at last. The family had been real even where the marriage had failed. Those years were not void because he had been insufficient. The love I gave was not wasted because it had been asymmetrically met. Love given in good faith is never waste. But it must stop being offered to places that require self-erasure as proof of devotion. Winter deepened. Some nights loneliness still came like weather through old windows. I would lie awake listening to branches scrape the siding and feel the full animal fact of being alone. Not unloved by friends, not abandoned by my children, not unsupported by the practical scaffolding of a competent life. Just alone in the way adult women are rarely permitted to admit without someone rushing in to fix it with platitudes. I learned to let loneliness sit down without assigning it prophecy. You are alone, I would think. That is true tonight. It does not mean you are forsaken. It does not mean you chose wrong now by leaving what was untrue. It only means the room is honest. Honesty became, strangely, a comfort. There is peace in no longer editing reality. No more translating absence into busyness. No more naming distance as stress or partial tenderness as enough. No more making myself indispensable in the hope that indispensability might mature into being cherished. I did not become hard. That would be the simpler story, and simpler stories rarely save us. I remained tender. I still cried at songs in grocery stores if they caught me unguarded. I still flinched when someone asked casually whether I was married, and I had to decide how much history to compress into one answer. I still missed the man Daniel had sometimes almost been. But I became accurate. By the time the first anniversary of his leaving approached, the house no longer felt like a mausoleum. It felt like a place in which a woman had survived contact with the truth and remained standing. I had changed things, not excessively, just enough. New curtains in the study. The guest room now fully a painting room, canvases stacked against the wall beside jars of brushes. Different dishes in everyday use because I realized I had been saving the ones I liked best for occasions, as though ordinary life did not qualify as deserving. One Saturday morning in early spring, I opened all the windows and let the cool air move through the rooms. I changed the sheets, put tulips in a glass pitcher on the table, and carried a box of old travel folders to the recycling bin. Not angrily, not ceremonially, just because I no longer needed evidence of futures that had not belonged to me. In the bottom of the box was a small envelope of printed photos from years ago, not the curated albums. Loose extras from a trip to Provence when the children were still young. In one photo, I am standing in a market square holding a bag of cherries, laughing at something outside the frame. My hair is windblown, my face unguarded. Daniel is not in the picture. I stared at it for a long time. What struck me was not my youth, though of course I was younger then. It was the aliveness in me when I was not orienting toward being seen by him. I looked fully present to my own experience, unmanaged, unperformed. I set the photo on the kitchen windowsill while I worked. Later, with sunlight moving across the floorboards and the house open to spring, I understood something with such calm finality that it felt less like revelation than homecoming. I had spent many years being the keeper of a life. I had remembered birthdays, packed lunches, booked flights, soothed tempers, folded fitted sheets, hosted grieving relatives, selected tiles, mailed thank you notes, kept everyone's favorite tea in stock, and learned the topography of each child's sadness by the sound of their footsteps on the stairs. I had made rooms warm. I had made holidays luminous. I had made continuity feel effortless. There is honor in that work, sacredness even. But being the keeper of a life is not the same thing as being cherished within it. That was the difference I finally knew in my bones. And once I knew it, I could not unknow it to save the old shape of things, nor did I want to. People sometimes speak of reinvention as if heartbreak should deliver a woman into some brighter, younger, more glamorous version of herself. New haircut, new city, new lover, new doctrine of self-optimization. That was never my story. My transformation was quieter, more domestic than dramatic. I became a woman who no longer rearranged reality to remain chosen. A woman who could grieve what she had built without continuing to live by its old terms. A woman who understood that being needed is not the summit of love, and that history, however beautiful, cannot substitute for intimacy. I do not know whether Daniel ever fully understood what he broke. Perhaps he understood enough to regret it. Perhaps he still tells himself a version in which the marriage had simply run its course, and the affair was a symptom, not an act. People are often gentler with themselves than the truth warrants. I no longer needed to know. Freedom, I discovered, is not always a feeling. Sometimes it is an absence of compulsion. The absence of needing the person who wounded you to finally become your witness. The absence of needing the past to admit what it was before you are allowed to leave it behind. There are still mornings when I wake too early and feel, for one dissolving second, that old disorientation, the sense that a body is missing from the bed and that the missing means danger. Then I breathe and the room comes into focus. The pale walls, the book on the nightstand, the fact that the bed belongs entirely to me now, and what arrives is not sorrow exactly, not joy either, something steadier. A relief with roots. Last week June came over for lunch. We ate tomato soup and sourdough in the kitchen while rain moved across the windows, and she asked whether I thought I would ever marry again. I smiled. Must the future always borrow its shape from the past? I asked. She laughed and said that sounded like something I would have taught her when she was 16 and heartbroken over a boy who played guitar and texted too little. Maybe it did. But beneath the lightness was something true. I no longer understood my life as an empty space waiting to be refilled by the correct arrangement of another person. My life was not a vacancy. It was a living thing. Altered, yes. Marked. Tender in places that would always ache at sudden weather, but alive in its own right. After lunch, when June left, I stood at the front door watching her walk down the path with her umbrella tilted against the rain. Then I closed the door and turned back into the house. The hallway was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to frighten me because it resembled loss. Now it felt different, spacious, earned. I touched the banister as I passed, the polished wood warm from years of hands. My hand, children's hands, the hand of a life that had happened, truly happened, regardless of the man who had failed to meet it honestly. The kitchen still held the scent of soup and wet coats. A tulip petal had fallen onto the table. Somewhere upstairs a floorboard settled, that familiar old house sound I used to hear and think of as company. Perhaps it still was, but not because it mimicked a marriage. Because it knew me. Because I had remained. Because in the aftermath of betrayal, in the long unwinding of illusion, in the room where pain had once stood like a permanent guest, I had become visible to myself in a way I never had while trying to preserve the life we called ours. And in that visibility there was grief, yes. There was still love, transformed into distance. There was mourning for the years spent making myself smaller so the structure could remain standing. There was sorrow for the woman who believed that if she tended carefully enough to the garden of family life, she would never have to name the emptiness in the center. But there was also this. A woman in her own house, no longer confusing endurance with devotion, no longer mistaking shared logistics for shared depth, no longer willing to disappear inside service and call it love. Outside, the rain eased. Light moved slowly across the sink. The afternoon opened. I stood very still in the middle of my kitchen and felt the strange, quiet bloom of a life returning not as spectacle, not as triumph, but as truth. The future no longer looked like a plan they made together, but it looked like truth, and that was enough. If something in this story felt familiar, if it touched a place you don't often put into words, I'd love to hear what stayed with you. You can share it in the comments, quietly, in your own way. And if you want more stories like this, the kind that sit with you and gently help you return to yourself, you can subscribe and stay close.